Welcome back to the channel, everybody. Today we got could the euro replace the U.S. dollar? So we're gonna go ahead and dive into this. Original link will be in the description if you want to check out the original video. And with that being said, we're smoking to all my dragons, divine righteous, almighty greats, overachieving, never slacking. And we getting straight to it. Here we go.
First part of a century, the US dollar has been the world's dominant reserve currency. However, Donald Trump's protectionist policies, his upending of the global economic order, and a growing US debt pile now threaten to erode the dollar's reserve status. And this might actually already be happening. The dollar's value as measured against a basket of other currencies has actually been falling for the past few months, and this Friday, the euro surged to a 3-year high against the dollar, despite a pretty weak European economy and Trump's tariffs, which should in theory make the dollar stronger. As a result, some European policymakers now argue that a stable euro could attract investors searching for alternatives to the dollar, and even replace it as the world's reserve currency. So in this video, we're going to take a look at why the US dollar is losing its reserve status, and why some people think that the euro has the potential to replace it as the world's reserve currency. We're getting remarkably close to 1 million subscribers, and currently 72% of you haven't yet subscribed. So lend us a hand and subscribe today. To get started, you need to understand the central role that the US dollar plays in the world's so-called reserve currency. A currency that central banks and other big financial institutions like to hold in their foreign exchange reserves because they're considered safe, in that their value will remain stable and that they can reliably be used to buy other things. The dollar's reserve status has its roots in the post-war Bretton Woods Agreement, when the US decided that they wanted the dollar to be the center of a new international monetary order. The dollar became the only currency that could be directly converted into gold, with all other major currencies then pegged to the dollar at fixed exchange rates. While the US ditched the gold standard in the early 70s, the dollar remained the world's dominant reserve currency, accounting for more than half of all reserves. Since its creation in 1999, the euro has held the second largest share of international reserves, and until about 2008, it appeared to be gaining on the dollar, increasing its share from 23.6% in 2002 to a peak of 27.6% in 2009. However, the Eurozone crisis in the 2010s, plus the fact that the US began growing faster than the EU in this period, undermined confidence in Europe, and the Euro's share of global reserves fell to 19% by the end of 2015. Today, the dollar still accounts for 90% of global transactions, and its share of reserves has remained at about 60%. Nonetheless, in the past few months or so, there has been some more substantive anxiety that Trump's policies could actually erode the dollar's reserve status. In short, Trump's unorthodox and erratic economic policies have undermined the dollar's reputation as a safe asset. This became glaringly evident early this week when the American stock market fell at the same time as both the dollar and treasuries. Now, usually when the stock market falls, the dollar and US treasuries go up because investors are moving out of riskier assets in the stock market into nominally safe assets like the dollar and US treasuries. The fact that all three fell together early this week is proof that investors are actually just pulling their cash out of America altogether.
That's got to be very scary for a lot of people to see how this change has taken place. This, that's got to be Trump's got to be scaring a lot of people. I tell you, and just the thought of the U.S. not being number one, I can only imagine the anxiety for those gatekeepers at the top.
And no longer see the dollar as a safe asset, or at least not as safe as it once was. Anxieties about the surety of the dollar have been further exacerbated by at least 3 other things. 1, the obscene amounts of debt that the US is currently issuing, sparking worries about either a default or the US inflating away its debt. 2, Trump's previous comments about devaluing the dollar to help America reindustrialize. And 3, his antagonistic attitude to America's long-standing allies and his enthusiasm for sanctions, which has made some investors anxious about the prospect of Trump seizing their dollar-denominated assets. Nonetheless, the big question for de-dollarization advocates has always been, what could actually replace the dollar? You might think that the yuan would be a good alternative, but that's not really the case, for at least two reasons. Firstly, China still has capital controls that effectively limit how much money can come in or out of the country via the CCP's influence over China's big banks. And secondly, the CCP actively devalues the yuan to keep its exports competitive. That sort of just leaves the euro then. As we mentioned a moment
I wonder what's going on with BRICS. I want to look that up real quick. BRICS.
just leaves the euro then. As we mentioned a moment ago, until the Eurozone crisis, the euro looked like a real contender, but weak growth and a sense that the European project had essentially stalled dampened enthusiasm.
Hi, I'm Andy Levian, General Counsel at the DNC.
So BRICS, which is an intergovernmental organization composed of 10 nations: Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, Egypt, Ethiopia, Indonesia, Iran, and the United Arab. I'm not sure how to pronounce that. Emirates. BRICS aims to create a more equitable global order and strengthen economic and political cooperation among member states. I wonder how that's doing. China and BRICS will defend global order as Trump withdraws, Brazil says. And that came out 2 days ago. And then 35 minutes ago, it says BRICS countries eye mechanism to help global economy. Gold price to hit 6,000 under Trump's term as dollar resets and BRICS accelerate gold buying. So that's definitely something to keep your eye on. BRICS, for those that have never heard of that.
We just sued President Trump and Doge, and I hope you will support.
However, if American growth continues to slow and the EU continues to move towards deeper integration, then the euro might become the least bad option. And counterintuitively, this process might actually be helped by the issuance of more euro-denominated debt, which is something we're currently seeing happen in both Germany, where incoming Chancellor Friedrich...
Could you imagine people in America, a shift where people in America are using euros like as the main currency? That'd be crazy. I could hear the music changing from gotta get this money to gotta get these euros. Gotta get these euros. That'd be wild.
Merz has just scrapped the debt brake to allow for massive increases in defence spending, and at the EU level, where Commission Chief Ursula von der Leyen is talking about issuing more joint EU debt to fund Europe's rearmament. This might sound counterintuitive. After all, you might expect that if European countries were issuing lots of debt, this would be a symptom of their economic weakness, and therefore make the euro less attractive as a reserve asset. But one of the big reasons that the dollar has been able to hold on to its reserve crown for so long is because treasuries, i.e. US debt, are the world's favourite debt instrument. You could even call treasuries the world's reserve bond. Again, somewhat counterintuitively, the fact that the US government borrows so much money, which involves issuing loads of treasuries, is perhaps the main reason that they're the world's reserve bond. And having so many treasuries floating about makes them attractive for two reasons. Firstly, they pay a non-trivial interest rate, and secondly, they're super liquid, i.e. you can always find a buyer for treasuries if you want to turn them back into dollars. This creates a sort of self-reinforcing loop. Dollars become more attractive to hold because they can always be used to buy treasuries, and treasuries become more attractive to hold because you know that they can always be sold for dollars, with both reinforcing the other's reserve status. Anyway, this is one of the reasons that German bonds, for instance, let alone EU bonds, have never really been able to replace treasuries. There just aren't enough of them floating about, which means that the market for them isn't particularly liquid. However, investors fled to German bonds last week when Trump's tariffs sparked treasury sell-offs. And if confidence in the dollar wanes at the same time that both Germany and the EU, perhaps the two most trustworthy entities in Europe, start issuing lots of new bonds, the euro and euro-denominated bonds could eat away at the dollar treasury complex. All in all, while the euro is unlikely to fully replace the dollar anytime soon, it could plausibly occupy a larger share of reserves as the world moves to, at least partly, diversify away from the dollar. And this story, like much of the news, is worth paying attention to in the weeks ahead, because with geopolitics in flux and Trump throwing the international order up in the air, there's a lot to keep an eye on. Every day we're faced with weird headlines, from Musk declaring anyone who looks at him the wrong way a terrorist.
That is true. That is true. Every day, weird headlines. I could see I could see the U.S. dollar just falling completely. I could. I wouldn't underestimate anything at this time, and it does seem like the U.S. is just on a decline. A lot of people would agree with that. Disagree with that, but every empire has its downfall. It's just how it goes. Things fall, things rise, things fall again. It just is what it is. I believe this is a fall right now for America. My personal beliefs. Call it a theory, I guess.
To Trump declaring war on Jupiter to try and regain some extraterrestrial allies.
Not war on Jupiter. Not war on Jupiter, no.
A terrorist, to Trump declaring war on Jupiter to try and regain some extraterrestrial allies. Okay, that second one wasn't real, but we do dive into the weird world of US politics in our series WTF USA. That's our show where we take big moments from culture and social media and try and explain the political implications of, say, Musk running around trying to put out Tesla fires. And unlike some of our other serious videos, the tone of WTF USA is more lighthearted and takes something of an irreverent look at what's going on. And if you're interested, WTF USA can be found exclusively on Nebula. Nebula is also home to some other incredible original content from your favourite creators, like Tom Nicholas's Boomers, discussing everything from generational inequality, housing, the climate crisis, and pensions. The globetrotting feature-length documentary tries to unpack the questionable legacy of the baby boomers. If you didn't know, Nebula is an independent, creator-owned streaming platform that specializes in thoughtful content from creators like Real Life Law, Wendover Productions, Legal Eagle, and Neo. And when it comes to us, it's not just WTF USA either. You can also watch every normal TLDR video on Nebula ad-free, and in some instances, before they even land on YouTube. If you're not a member already, you can click our link in the description to get 40% off. That's just $36 a year, or $3 a month. So take the news a little less seriously, and check out WTF, only on Nebula.
Okay, shout out to TLDR News again. What y'all think? Let me know in the comments. My throat's a little sore, so I'm not doing too much talking today just because I got to clear that up. It might be that the allergies kicking in with spring. But I said my prediction. I personally think the dollar will fall. That's just my prediction. The U.S. dollar. Y'all let me know what y'all think in the comments. I'll be back with more soon. Much love.